All right. Well, folks, welcome. We are back and live, and it's nice to have you all here. We're here. This is the continuation to that series that I started, Don't Know Much About, because I do wonder sometimes how much we do know about the Constitution. As I said, we know many of the stories because, of course, the drama at that Constitutional Convention was so high. And we're going to see maybe why that was. But we know a lot about that, but what do we know about actually what's in the Constitution? And this came up a few years back um, because you have to swear an allegiance in any public office. When I was on the city council, you swore an allegiance to uphold the Constitution, and that is part of the entire situation. I always wonder, you know, do people know what's in the Constitution? So there's always that thought, and we're going to have a better idea by the time we get through tonight. Now, I'm kind of hoping Sue's going to take over on. Yeah, Pat. That's who joined. Thank you. Glad to have you here, Pat. But I'm kind of hoping Sue will take care of some of the other items because right now we're going to go into a little bit of a question and answer thing. You don't really have to answer out loud. You can if you're unmuted, but you know, just a quick survey. When you think of American government, are you thinking of the executive, the legislative, or the judicial arm? And I could state that differently. The presidency, does that represent American government to you? Congress, or, the Supreme Court, or things like that? Which one of those things do you think of when you think of American government? And perhaps on the other hand, we did do one on state government. Maybe it's your state and local government you think of. But traditionally, when I'm talking about American government, I'm speaking of, the actual overarching government of the United States. So you think about that a few moments. And now I'm going to ask you, if you had to rank the presidency, the Senate, and the House, which one is the most important? Which one do we hear about the most? That's an easy one because the news media, and this has been true long before, the current office holder, the news media has long followed what's up with the president. So with that, then I'm also going to ask the third question. Which of those is the least important today? Which one do we hold in the least, in the, which one do we give the least love to? My point is, does anyone here think the House is the most important arm of the US government? And if so, what would lead you to that conclusion in today's world?
So in
What?
the notes, we have some responses. I
Okay.
said the House, and I was just thinking because it's the branch that has the representatives from, from the states based
Yep.
on the population
Mm-hmm.
and if I don't know if I remember this correctly, do they do the budget? So
Well, in the old days, they did the budget. They are the ones that write, that have to approve the checks in more or less. Um, quite honestly, you are right. And my point is, if you had asked any of the founders, they would tell you absolutely without a doubt that it's the House that is the most important.
mm,
And of course, my point to that is, when is the last time you saw a single news story that even remotely claimed the House was the most important one? That they were driving anything. But in the founders' day, it was expected that the House would drive much of it. And remember some of the history that I've taught you over the years. The House really was the one in the lead through most of the 19th century. And just so you all know, you know, spoiler alert, next term we're going to do a talk on what I call the Roosevelt Revolution, and that's actually Theodore Roosevelt, because it is Theodore Roosevelt at the start of the 1900s that actually changed how we view the presidency. Now, truth be told, it could be Woodrow Wilson that changed how everybody thought about it, but it is Theodore Roosevelt that taught us how important the president and the presidency is. So, with that, I was asking that survey. I will just tell you, Gallup does a survey every year and have been for a long time on the institutions that Americans trust the most and least. Small business always leads the way. And in fact, in 2025, the most recent numbers show that small business is up to a 70% trust rate. Okay. Followed by the military, which is also up. It's up to 62%. Police ranks at 45%. Church has made a sweep up, which is 36%, and the presidency has hovered around 30% of late. Back in 2000, that was a much higher number. But anyway, the public school system has been on the way up at 29%. All the rest of these are falling and have been falling for years and years. Newspapers and television, ironically, have almost held steady at 17 or 18%, which is probably in newspapers' case, that's probably more than what than people who have newspaper subscriptions. So I find that interesting. Television news is down to about 11% at this point. So all of those pieces, big business ranks near the bottom, but I want you to see the one that has been on the bottom for years, decades, actually, and that is Congress at 8%. And that's about where it sits. It was at around 11%, was still at the bottom, but as everything's been dropping the last 10 to 15 years, it still is at the bottom. And when you really think about it, when the founders were creating the Constitution, one of the things we need to realize, it was not the presidency that they were creating. And it was not the presidency that they considered to be the important work. And you can tell that by where they spent most of their time in making that Constitution. So we're going to step back just to get a little bit of history to talk about where that's at. We're going to start around, really just a quick run by of the Revolution. Note that 1781, 1787, and then, of course, thinking about how all of this ties into today should be part of what we're doing today. So, welcome. By the way, the one thing I am not going to do tonight is the thing I do every time. I am not going to ask you if you can tell me one thing that you remember from last week, because I don't think I would remember. So, there we go. So, one of the questions, though, is why do we have a government? We're all adults here. What's a government provide? What do they give us? And these are just the thought points that I want you considering. I always like to give you a few questions to think about. So, one, why have a government at all? And why did we discard the Articles of the Confederation? It got us through the war, right? Why did we get rid of it? What's new about the US Constitution, new for their time, and maybe even still today? And what limits were the designers under when they were creating the Constitution? What did they hope to create? Was there something that they couldn't do? Were there things that they wanted to do? How did we just arrive at what we got? So, one of the things that I want you to realize, though, really the unique aspect of the Constitution was the fact that they wrote it down. They wrote it down and made it available to everybody. What they were saying is they were putting out the rules to make the resulting government abide by what they promised, but more importantly, They were drawing a line in the sand. They were saying, this is what we're going to deliver. Now, governments provide. Why do we have a government? They provide a platform. Bottom line, the key aspect when you go back through history before the US, governments provide a platform for protection from unwanted aggression or violence. And that aggression could be internal or external to the community. So I want you to think about this. Many of you have sat through my talks on the various Native American groups that populated North America during that entire time that I was doing all that. Yeah, I think we need somebody muted out there. I'm not sure who that would be. There we go. Um, but think about what I said about all those, what we found over and over and over again in all of those Native American populations throughout North America, and it's really been true everywhere since the start of time, is that the big tribes picked on the little tribes. And when I say picked on, that's a nice way. They invaded, they captured people, they killed people, they took prisoners, they took slaves, etc. Or ransom them, or just, for the ones that had already turned to farming, many of them would show up at harvest time and take half or more of the harvest and burn the rest of it, whatever they couldn't carry, um, just inviting themselves to the spoils. And, you know, let's remember I'd mentioned the Articles of Confederation, what the colonies had done as the uh, as the break with Great Britain came along. Those Articles of Confederation only created for one simple reason: the threat of violence and theft by Great Britain. They were joining together to try to prevent, that reality. And for example, when the British took over Boston and then later New York in the 1774, 1775, 1776, people living there learned a bitter lesson. And of course, this picture that we see here is one of the early renditions of the Boston Massacre. But of course, all of those places were considered to be hotbeds of rebel behavior. They got what was coming to them, right? I don't think so, but um, so the occupation of Boston, 1774. Boston is occupied, the port is closed. So if you worked in shipping or you were one of those people that just made your money loading and unloading ships, you were out of a job. Massachusetts government was stripped of all power. Troops were quartered at will, meaning they could decide your house looked like a great place for the troops to be sleeping, and they really didn't care where you were going to sleep. And remember, all trials of British officials will happen in England, not out here. Um, in other words, if atrocities or problems or anything else happened, oh well, it's going to be far too far away for you to come and observe justice as it happens. And of course, later when Philadelphia fell, there were many Tories living in Philadelphia. It's just that that's also because it was inland and it was also, a major port. But being inland, it was not quite as exposed. But that also is where the rebels had set up their government, right? And when Philadelphia fell, the Tories living there soon realized exactly what a British victory would look like, and it wasn't necessarily pleasant for them either. And when I say they learned what it would look like, they had to live in close proximity to the British troops all winter in 1777 and 1778. And remember, as the winter closed in, it was thought that the rebellion was truly over. They had chased George Washington and the Continental troops all the way across New Jersey, and in fact, it was just a why bother to wipe them out? They're done. They're finished. They can't do anything. That occupation of Philadelphia, homes were taken by the British commanders to say, we like this. This looks good. And, of course, the Tories had the nicest looking homes, so sometimes it was theirs. Anyone suspected of any rebel sympathy was turned out of their livelihood, and that was the best they could hope for. Local presses learned there was absolutely no freedom of expression. If you were touting the rebel line, it was very likely they were going to come and break up your press, i.e., you'd be out of a job and out of money. In short, anything the local commander wanted, they took. And of course, there was absolutely no recourse. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is after 1779, Southern loyalists to the crown actually invited the British to come south. They were promised the South is not as committed to this insanity as the North is. But with the shift south, the loyalists and rebels both learned there's no safe place when you have no representation in your own government. In the end, the occupation of the South and the terror in the countryside would arouse rebel sympathies, far beyond what had been there when it first started. So 1779, Savannah is occupied. That's the first to be taken. And this brings all those Hessians to the South. And of course, they're the German troops, the hirelings, that really had their way with food, with houses, with people, and brought a very bad feeling, to everyone. And this is just first of many British victories in the South. Major cities like Charleston, Camden, and all the rest were to follow. And then when that wasn't putting an end to it, they did a slash and burn march through both of the Carolinas diagonally. They tried that in Virginia and found out that the Virginians were not ready to roll over. So that's a different story. But in the South, again, as you're exposed to the situation, you start realizing really there's reasons we're taking up arms against the British. And remember, early on, when all this was before it started, Benjamin Franklin, who was the representative to the crown, would say, if British soldiers are sent into the colonies, they will not find a rebellion. They may indeed make one. And I think that's still true to this day. And in the South, now feeling the sting of the British whip arises to the call of the revolution. And of course, it's in the South that in 1781 that, you know, the victory will actually occur. Now, a lot of that is, of course, because Franklin had persuaded the French to join on our side, to take up arms, to declare war on England. And it's the French Navy that will prevent the withdrawal of the British troops when Washington's superb entrapment, of that successful British army, when they lured them into the trap at Yorktown, they slammed it shut, and it would be the end of the war. Now, remember, this is another reason for a government to have a foreign policy and to bring allies along to have all of these things happening. And I've mentioned many times, I use the line that no idea can move faster than a horse. Well, think about this. That loss, that devastating loss, which really ended the war in America, that news of that loss took over a month to reach England. And when Lord North received it, it was said he took it like a musket ball to the gut. And North would say it's all over. They knew they couldn't sustain this. Remember, the whole reason they got into this mess was they had defended the colonies in the French and Indian War, as the French, who were starting to occupy much of the space between the Mississippi and the Alleghenies, conflicts started to arise. And what that meant was battles followed. And of course, after those battles, after that 7 years of war, the British said, well, we've spent money to safeguard these colonies, my gosh, we should get that money back in the form of excise taxes, in the form of any way they could get it. And that's what set everything off. So, you know, reality is, although the king still thought the war could continue, it was an illusion. But remember, it's going to take 2 years to wrap it up. There's not the major battles afterwards, but there's still friction. Now, I'd mentioned the Articles of Confederation. They did what they were supposed to do. Really, they were an incredible feat to put together these 13 colonies, to get them all to work together and agree that they were going to take up arms and help each other in that fight against England. But there is absolutely nothing in there about governing. All that is, yep, we agree to work together on these things. There was nothing in there about governing. And in fact, you couldn't govern with them because every single state, formerly colony, every single one of them had veto power. It had to be unanimous or it wasn't going to happen. So once the war was over, the articles just became impossible. And, that within a year of the end of the war with Britain, it was very clear the various states were starting to fall and fall fast. And for example, victorious, the states were completely non-cooperative with their fellow states, be the issue shared waterways or interstate commerce. Oh, well, you want to cross that river, and sell some of your goods over here. We'll decide how much that's going to cost you, and it's going to be a lot. Can we build bridges together? Can we do anything? No, we can't. And most importantly, the war debt went unpaid. And in the North, where they actually tried to raise the taxes in order to do that, remember, it was taxation, although we say it was taxation without representation. It was taxation that started everything. And as the local taxes went up in the North, rebellions were breaking out. And farmers were especially hard pressed, and having fought in the war and everything else, they did not feel it was their place to have to do this. With all of this, the smart guys, the people looking at things in a broader picture, realized on a lot of levels this was not going to last. It could not last. And George Washington, who had successfully led the rebellion and who had successfully stepped away from all of it, refusing the offer to become a monarch that his men had tried to put forward, he was again lured out of retirement because the biggest issue being that war debt. The French came to our rescue, and the French and the people in Amsterdam had all ponied up a lot of money. And now as the clock is ticking on those being repaid, and the repudiation that would happen for failing to pay that debt was a major concern. But again, that uprising of farmers in Massachusetts and the difficulty of trying to put that down, that was the sharp stick. So the real truth is the inability to do any business was the fear, because of course, if your country essentially becomes blacklisted due to the fact that you didn't pay your bills, there was going to be trouble. So with all of that, there were people out there that realized we have to do something. And that something was, how do we fix the Articles of Confederation? But the truth is, the Articles of Confederation, as I said, first of all, just the fact that there really was no structure to them and that everything had to be unanimous, they'd proved totally inadequate on two issues, taxation and authority. Neither were possible. And thus, as really two of the men behind the concept of getting together to fix it, James Madison and some guy named Hamilton, would come together, and both of them had some plans. But the difference is James Madison truly had a plan, literally. He had written it down, and it's called the New Virginia Plan. And that new Virginia plan reveals a critical fact that we can't overlook. All of these prime movers had made up their minds on the concept of one nation, that all of these individual states had to come together as one nation. Now, as I said, the key was the ability to tax and that ability to raise an army, because those former revolutionaries who had risen up in Massachusetts, um, trying to put them down really only brought more to the fore. They were protesting the same way they had learned at the start of the revolution, showing up at courthouses, protesting loudly, being obnoxious and refusing to pay their taxes. And what would happen then is, as the state or the county tried to crack down, more people rose against the state or county. So no government was going to exist if you didn't have those two things. But there were limits on what Madison or anybody else could propose. The new government had to remain true to the revolution, just as it had to make sure it was going to pay those bills. You kind of had a virtual bill that was due to everyone who had fought in the revolution, because they had believed in the things that had been declared in the Declaration of Independence and in other materials that had persuaded them all to fight. Specifically, those ideals had to continue forward. It's just that instead of single countries, we wanted to have one overarching country. As I said, there's limits. Remember, rights. Initially, it was the stepping on of various rights that had sparked a lot of the beginning phase of the revolution. That freedom of speech, that issue of freedom of press. Those things were big, and the right to be represented. Those are all rights. But just as we just mentioned with those farmers, now we saw that it was the government's, you know, ability to remove life and property that really spurred everybody to action in the American Civil War. It is when Lexington and Concord happens. It is when you occupy Boston. It's when you occupy and then fire on people in New York. When you're actually going to battle against those natives, that's when the action started to occur. So while rights matter, it's the seizure of property or the loss of property in the form of damage to business interests that set the continent ablaze. But in upholding those ideals, some of them would prove rather difficult to reconcile. The biggest one in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the ideal that all men were created equal sounded great, and it was written by a Southerner. But of course, that caused a lot of conflict when some people, and remember at this point, it's not just confined to the South, that some people considered other men their property, then you have a conflict. This is the cause of the tension at the center of the Constitutional Convention, and it will be at the center of the of the Constitution itself until it's resolved. Well, technically, I'd say, resolved the Civil War, but in reality, it continues on into the 20th century, doesn't it? So now we get to the point. What's in the Constitution, right? The Constitution is the answer to the debate sparked when the colonies were told they'd have to pay off after the French and Indian War ended. Colonial representation in Parliament was a sham. It was a virtual representation. Yeah, sure. We're going to send Benjamin Franklin over there and he'll talk at you. One of the most admired men, one of the most intelligent men in the world, well known. Nobody's going to listen to him, though. He's a hick from the sticks. And in this, the first thing up in the Constitution, they are going to spell out how you achieve representation in this new government and what that government can and cannot do. And it starts right off the start. We all know the line, we the people. Well, let's look at that. We the people puts everyone on notice that the powers here are different from the Articles of Confederation. It all draws, from the people. Remember the Articles. Who did they list? The Articles drew their power from each of the states. We call them states now, each of their own little countries. And it's in this that this document tells us what it's going to achieve. We all know the opening part. We, the people of the United States. That's asserting that the government's power originates with people, not a monarch, not something given to you by a monarch, not something given to you by a state. It is a fundamental law. And of course, they're using the word fundamental. Some would say God given. It is a law that is, as it says, immutable. In order to form a more perfect union, well, you don't have to look any farther than the mess that was going on under the Articles of Confederation to understand why that line is there. They're aimed at being more effective, more unified as a nation. And to do that, they're going to establish justice. And what that means is creating a system of laws, and those laws mean courts to ensure fairness and to protect rights. We don't really think of how important the courts are. We often think, yeah, maybe derogatorily toward, they're going to take it to court and drag it out. But really, you can have all the laws in the world. If you don't have a court to arbitrate, nothing's ever going to happen. And it goes on to say to ensure domestic tranquility. So, again, that's that piece that I talked about, maintaining peace and order within the country. And why within the country? Well, we have lots of examples, of course, whether it's how natives who had agreed to live within the confines of the United States later, or, go even closer to our time, did all the people of Japanese descent who happen to live on the west coast of the United States really want to give up all of their worldly possessions and move to the desert? I don't think so. So that's that ensure domestic tranquility, right? And saying that if you go back one, then we've got laws that prevent people from taking things away. We've got courts, so you can go to court to prevent it from being taken from you, right? So, and to provide for the common defense. Of course, this refers to what I said early on was the number one responsibility of government to protect the nation from outside threats by use of a military. But it's also there to promote the general welfare. This is a commitment. We're going to, bring overall we want well-being of the citizens and enable them to live happy and healthy lives, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, of course, what they're really saying is to protect the freedoms, to protect the rights. Remember, though, in an earlier talk, I had mentioned that to them, everybody at this time realizes you have to work. Liberty doesn't mean I'm free not to do anything. It means I'm free to pursue, my interests, and one of those interests to make enough to feed myself, to have something. But the blessings of liberty, i.e., the concept that we have representation in our government, and to ensure that for ourselves and our posterity. And of course, the posterity, that's their kids, their grandkids, that's us, all the people on down the road. Their goal is to protect those freedoms for not only the current generation, but for future ones. And to do all that, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. Well, they've made a lot of promises. They've told us what they want to achieve, and now they have to do it. And what they do, straightforward. And I don't know how many of you have read this, and it's pretty easy to get. There are, let's see if I can grab this. you know, it all fits in a little tiny book, and you can get that, and you can, read about what it was they're hoping to achieve and how they were going to do it. We, of course, just take for granted it's been going, it's gone on for years. We assume it's there, but let's start breaking it down. Article 1 lays out the operation. There's going to be two houses. First, the House, the House of Representatives, and it tells us in section 1, tells us how the House is organized, who can be a representative. It tells us taxes, and it also tells us how slaves are counted for representation. But remember, and this is an important point, you will not find the word slave anywhere in the Constitution. Okay, we know who they're talking about, but how other people, not citizens, are counted for representation. And it also tells us that the House, not only does the House give us taxes, with that, it also tells us that the House has the sole power of impeachment, i.e., to bring the executive to heel. And impeachment means we're going to lay out the charges, right? And what's interesting is in how they list it. They don't say if we need to impeach the president. They basically say when. It is expected that that can happen, and they have made that path very clear. Then in section 2, they go on to talk to us about the Senate. And of course, at that time, senators are appointed. Senators are appointed, meaning they're appointed by the state or the state legislature. And that was part of that last little piece, that Franklin had brought along that had brokered everything at the last minute to make this all possible. The fact that you've got the House based on the size of, of each state, the number of people living in it, and the Senate to give it balance by saying, oh, you each have 2 votes. You can vote any way you want, but, it's expected, since they are in office at the behest of the state, they're appointed by the state, it's expected they're going to be listening to them, while the representatives, it's expected, will be listening to the people on the street, the people who vote them in. But of course, let's remember, not to be overlooked, at this point, who can vote? Not women. And even with men, it's only property owners, right? Now that's going to change, relatively quickly, but it's still there. So it also points out then that, on that issue of impeachment, that it's the Senate that will hear the charges and then make the decision as to whether the person should be removed. So, as we see in that Article 1, we've got the layout of Congress, and it tells us about Congress and the 2 houses. Section 2 tells us how the House of Representatives are configured. It tells us in 3 how the Senate is. 4, it tells us how elections happen, and it basically is laying it all out step by step, based on the last types of elections in each of those states. And then also it goes on to talk to us about the elections for the presidency as well. Because remember, at this time, and why is that House so important? At this time, the House has a big piece. Now, 5 gets into the powers and duties of Congress. 6, the rights for members. And 7, what the legislative process is like. 8, the powers of Congress. That's all in Article 1. And, to think about that, the duties that it gives to the House, only the House can originate revenue bills. So only the House can get the bills paid. Only the House can impeach an executive. And if a presidential candidate does not get a majority of the electoral votes, the House chooses the president. Because remember what I said, really early on, you were really only voting for one person to represent you. That was the person who occupied the House. The Senate's taken care of by others. and you might technically vote for president, but really you were voting for an electoral college member who would then choose whether or not to follow what you'd suggested, because that was the point. It was expected that you would have a lot of regional people and that you would not necessarily get majorities. And thus, it would be up to those electoral college members to decide who was a good candidate, who was going to pull this off. Now, as I said, Article 1, Section 8 tells us how they're going to levy taxes. And the big thing they tell us is all taxes must be uniform, meaning if you're in the South, you're in the North, you're still paying the tax the same way. You're still paying it on the same types of goods. You are still paying it in the same amounts that somebody else would be as well. Now, Congress can borrow money. Congress regulates commerce with foreign nations. And how does it do that? Just a question. How does it do that? When we say you're going to regulate commerce, well, we know that treaties have to be okayed by the Senate, but they're not the ones that are negotiating the treaty, are they? Oh, you know what? And it actually says it in here. Congress regulates commerce, meaning Congress decides tariffs on those foreign nations that they're dealing with. Not the presidency, Congress. And it's written there, and that has not been unwritten. There are a few things here that get unwritten. That's not one of them. Now, it also tells us that, it's Congress that's going to end up working with Indian tribes, which is another way of telling us outright Indian tribes are not citizens. They are citizens of their own country, of their own nation. It's in this section that we get the laws on naturalization. In other words, on how you can move here and become a citizen of the United States. And that is a pretty important piece. It's on Congress, nobody else. It's not on the states. Now, the states may decide where and how you can vote, but as far as becoming a citizen, if you're here now, you are a citizen. But in the coming years, if you move here from outside the United States, this is how you'll become a citizen. By the way, they also promote science and they protect the idea of patents, which is, in other words of saying, we want the research that will create new patents, that will create valuable goods and valuable money for others. And in fact, that still goes on today, doesn't it? That's one of the reasons why, you have research labs at many of these colleges and why they get grants from the government. Those grants are not about anything other than the fact that it's going to pay dividends to the United States to be the ones that discover that next great medicine or that next great invention, especially on scientific lines. By the way, it tells us how the military will be created. And in doing so, it works very hard to limit the idea of a standing army, telling us how they have to be paid, when they have to be paid, and things like that. By the way, it also tells us the ability to call out state militias for a cause, to bring them into other states. And that is on Congress, supposedly. It's actually there, and to invite them in, it has to be done by the state as well, right? But heck, that never comes up, does it? All right. The idea is Congress will make all laws necessary to make these things work, to be proper. And all of these items are explicit. None of this is, oh, well, notice we're right down to telling you how we're going to do patents. We're right down to telling you these are the people who are going to take care of it and which arm of government does it. All of those men that were part of that constitutional convention were there because they were the smarter people. They knew their history. They understood the challenges of creating a government that others had faced in the past. Article 2, of course, tells us how a person becomes president and what the president's powers are, which, are pretty limited. It's basically to carry out the laws as executed by the Congress, also to negotiate those treaties and things like that. But it also, Article 2 will go into the Electoral College and how it works, which maybe needed a little more work. It might have been a little half baked. As we would see in the election of 1800, it would already be evoked uh, because of the fact that it was kind of unclear in how it was written. Again, it explains the naturalization clause, the president's powers, the civilian command over the military, which, of course, the president is the civilian in charge of the military. And it also goes on to tell us the president has to communicate with Congress from time to time, which we have come to see as a yearly report, which used to be delivered in writing. Now, of course, the president shows up because he can be on TV and might get a few people to watch, and generally lays out his entire agenda for the coming year. We call it the State of the Union. By the way, that issue of the Electoral College was not something to sneeze at. As I said, it got evoked in 1800. It's Electoral College. It's in use every single election. But in 1824, we have the first time that a man will occupy the presidency having lost the popular vote. Happens again 1876 and 1888 and again in 2000. Each of those cases. Now, of course, that's not the last one. I don't know. Can you pick the eyes out of that group? The person who also won the popular vote by a really far greater than any of those numbers and did not manage to get to the presidency. Also, that's another way of saying this page is the losers, right? Isn't it amazing how we do that? You can actually attain the highest number of votes anybody had ever gotten and be considered a loser. I don't know. Anyway, Article 3 is my favorite. It talks about the Supreme Court and courts in general. And it defines treason, which is a reminder to us that the people who were writing all of this had just lived through a time when corruption and actually treason were, was a reality, that it was out there. We saw a number of generals who got captured and then were paroled back, but remained on the payroll of the British, and then tried to undercut Washington or just the entire uh, activity of the war. And then, of course, there's also, Benedict Arnold, who had gotten, you know, ignored when he was the guy that had saved the day. So he turns over and goes to work for the British. So there were plenty of examples, but my favorite part about Article 3 is it sets up the courts. And here we go. Are you ready? This is about it. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. That's pretty much it. The Supreme Court is supreme. All the other courts are inferior to it. It does not tell us what the Supreme Court does. It does not tell us how it'll do it. It doesn't even tell us how many people will be on it. It just says, Congress will figure that out. And, it's kind of like you got this box to be filled in later, but we'll give you the outline of what you're supposed to be putting in here. And they do, they will. But because of that, it takes the Supreme Court a little while to actually mature. And in doing so, changes everything. Article 4, this is the regulating the relation between the states. This one is vitally important because, of course, that was the downfall of the Articles of Confederation. It uses some of the items from the Articles, but it also establishes that all citizens of a state has all of their rights in all of the other states. But it also has a clause that later will get taken out. It's a fugitive clause. because the Constitution is really about protecting property, in the cases where that property might have the ability to get up and escape from its owner, it will actually outline how, if they go to live in another state, they have to be returned to their state. Now, this will be overridden and changed, but it is, an important article for other things. One of the biggest pieces that makes Article 4 so important is it tells us that each state shall have a government Republican in nature. What that really means is, as a republic, i.e., as representatives voted into at least one house of a state legislature. Every state must be that. You could not have a monarchy and become part of the United States. You have to have representative government. So, also, this is where we will mandate that all states will honor all the laws of other states. And of course, sometimes that happens and sometimes that doesn't. And they use as an example here, well, if a couple is married in Florida, it's also considered married in Arizona. Someone convicted of a crime in Virginia is also guilty of that crime, in Wyoming. But of course, it's the 1960s before that is tried in the courts so that an interracial couple can be recognized in every state in the Union, when just a few states before that recognized it. The point is, this is the piece that is supposed to be guaranteeing that all citizens of one state will be treated equally and fairly like all the citizens of another. And, that if one flees to another, they will be returned. And also, this is where we outline how new states are admitted and how there will be control of federal lands. So there is that Article 4, Section 4 that I talked about. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So in other words, remember, that the legislature, you might notice, are the ones that are constantly being told they're in charge. So, a vitally important one is Article 5, which tells us how we will amend this Constitution. Unlike the Articles, unanimity is not required. And of course, we're all aware of this. We can make it by 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, or a constitutional convention called by 2/3 of the states, and that then gives us 3/4 of the state constitutional conventions, and that will result in a new amendment. So these are the amendments, a formal way to fix the Constitution, something that was actually not possible with the Articles of Confederation, where 100% agreement was necessary. As I said, under the Articles of Confederation, every state legislature had veto power over everything, and it didn't work, and the people knew it. They also knew that they were not smart enough to address every situation, and thus you have the ability to fix it by amendment. Article 6, the Constitution is the law of the land. They make that really simple sounding, but of course, that's the one that really could cause a lot of trouble because the states are saying they have to abide by it. Office holders, all office holders have to swear to uphold the Constitution, not just federal office holders. But it also is in this one that it says no religious test may ever be applied to decide if someone is capable or qualified to take a position with the government. And Article 7, how this Constitution is going to be ratified. You know, and the interesting thing about that is they say it will be done by a convention, state conventions. They know there's no way they can get this through the state legislatures. So they're saying every state will hold a convention. It will decide how the people can show up to be heard. And then that convention will decide whether or not they approve this new constitution. And they also put it down that 9 states had to approve it for it to go into effect. And as soon as 9 states do, others can continue to join, others can act within and with it, but they are not members until they decide they're going to take part. They state that the Constitution is the supreme law, but at that time, federal laws only applied to the federal government, or so they said. That really remains a little confusing, doesn't it? But this is what they worked out in working through the heat of the summer in Philadelphia for 4 long months. And in the end, it must have been right, because like any committee meeting, in the end, no one is happy with the result. That's a given for committees, right? In fact, it almost fails. And it is only saved at the last minute by a proposal from an old, ailing gentleman. And that man, of course, is Ben Franklin. And he states, very quietly, I confess, sir, that at present there are parts of this Constitution that I do not at all at present approve of. But I am not sure that I shall never approve of them. As in all of his efforts, it's Franklin that holds the key to joining people together with differing opinions. And he got these people together, not with speeches, but with conversations. Private conversations between 2 individuals, pushing them forward, pushing them in the right direction. And it is Franklin that will lead the way to that final compromise on that issue of representation. The idea of having, the Senate balance off the House based on the number of people you have, the Senate based, to give you equality and thus hold it down. So on that last day, it's his compromise proposal that is read and passes. And the interesting thing is, it's a method he first proposed in the Albany Agreement in 1754. Almost the same. But as the convention adjourns, everyone exhausted, the final act is that they, we always hear that it was Franklin was the final thing. No, Franklin's was the final thing that passed. The final act that happened was an effort, because so many people were saying there has to be a Bill of Rights for this Constitution. We added bills of rights to all of our state constitution. There must be one on this. And it fails. It fails. And they're disgusted. They have come to the end. They do have a constitution. It does not have a Bill of Rights, but they have a constitution. And that constitution, as a woman confronts Franklin leaving the convention hall, what kind of a government have you given us, sir? A republic, madam, if you are strong enough to keep it. Because everyone in that room knew that there had never been a republic that stretched as far and as wide as those 13 former colonies did across this land. James Madison, the guy who had done so much to create this, is not thrilled with the final product either. But as I said, neither is anybody else. In the end, it is signed by all still present except for 3. And these 3 are really important: Edmund Randolph, George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry. And 2 of those men were the men who had convinced George Washington to come out of retirement to add his gravitas to leading this, to say, He didn't run it, he didn't decide anything, he didn't organize anything, but by being involved, the rest of the country paid attention and felt that if he thought it was good, it probably was good. So why not those three? Well, we'll also notice that, like Washington, they are former revolutionaries. Notice that so many others in this room are younger. And we're going to see that there comes to be a split between what the older revolutionaries call the new men. But some of those new men are about the age of Lafayette, about the age of Hamilton, both of whom were involved. And of course, Madison was involved at the state level with the revolution. But, when it's all said and done and Washington gets home after the new document's been created and he's given a copy, he writes to, a man who is almost his adopted son, Lafayette. It is now a child of fortune to be fostered by some, buffeted by others. What will be the general opinion on or reception of it is not for me to decide, nor shall I say anything for or against it. Ooh, he's not going to go out and promote it. He's not putting himself on the line. He's saying, hey, I did what you asked. I oversaw the convention. It's now up to everybody else. We gave it our best shot. But, others that are reading it, John Adams is in England, acting as ambassador, and Jefferson in France, same thing. They both read it. They both are really pleased with it, but both ask, where's the Bill of Rights? And that's the question on the minds of everyone. And interestingly enough, it will end up being the brilliant stroke that actually makes this possible. But first, who's against it? All of these other people saying we're going to create a federal government. Going to create a federal government because, of course, we couldn't do business before. We couldn't cross, what are the rules for crossing state lines with goods? How do we share these waterways? What can we do to make all this happen? That's why we need a federal government. So who could be against that? Well, one of the earliest revolutionaries, Samuel Adams. I trip as I cross the threshold, said Sam Adams. His beliefs are such that any rights held by a government are far beyond anything that he can approve of. And most of these people want no check on the states. They want that power at the state level. We're all individual states. We don't need no federal government. And what's going to happen, though, is he's not the only one. Patrick Henry, the storming orator who we think of as one of the defiant early, patriots. He demands that there be a Bill of Rights. Although it's ironic because as governor of Virginia, he abused the one that is often held up as an example, the Virginia Constitution and its Bill of Rights. He was the worst offender of ignoring those rights for state citizens. All of these men come together. Since the others are calling themselves Federalists, they become known as the Anti-Federalists. And what they do is they go, this is our key point. There's no Bill of Rights. So they use that as the way they are going to derail this Constitution from happening. They had issues that were much broader than that, but that's the one that's easy to focus on. Many of the states, what happens is the Federalists will say, you know what? We agree with you. We think there should be a Bill of Rights. And you know what we'll do? We will make that our first action of the new government. We will draft a Bill of Rights so you can opt for conditional ratification. You can say, you bet, if you get a Bill of Rights, then we will accept this. So just vote that, yes, we're going to accept this, and we will rescind it if you don't create that Bill of Rights, if you don't get it attached as amendments. Now, the thing is, although both Madison and Hamilton were against the idea of a Bill of Rights, they both also knew that this is one of those pivotal moments when the discussion of whether or not we need a federal government is going to be had across the country, and it's going to play out in the newspapers. And the two of them will split because they will be facing all the old revolutionaries, or many of the old revolutionaries. And what they will do is, as the younger men, they are going to take the lead on the argument that's going to take place in the papers. Now, we're all familiar with the Federalist Papers, and of course, that is our number one window into the world of what what the founders, what these men at this Constitution convention thought they were creating. We'll realize that's just the argument that was happening in New York. That's where the Federalist Papers will get published. Arguments like that in different ways and in different places happen in almost every state in the newspapers. This is one of those events that is highly discussed and highly watched, and the participation level was great. Now, James Madison does not want to create a Bill of Rights. The Constitution itself is a Bill of Rights, and he was also well aware of the fact that Patrick Henry had completely ignored the Bill of Rights attached to his own state government's constitution. And Alexander Hamilton would say a Bill of Rights could even be dangerous. If you list all the things the government could not do, then what we're saying is anything not on that list, it's implied the government could do that. And we can't think of everything they shouldn't be able to do. But, the guys in the middle, the guys between the old revolutionaries and the young revolutionaries, the new men, which Hamilton and Madison are, you've got the John Adams, you've got the Jefferson, both of whom think, this is a great start if we just get a Bill of Rights added on there. And of course, Jefferson, being Jefferson, writes to Madison to say all supportive things, but then turns to things he doesn't like. And first, quote, first, a Bill of Rights. And he goes on for pages, as Jefferson was wont to do. Madison writes back, parchment barriers could not protect liberty. They didn't in our own state. They had witnessed this, not under the English, but under the states since independence. But Jefferson, strikes back. Parchment barriers might not be important, but the Bill of Rights would possibly hold back a tyrannical majority by placing a check in the hands of the judiciary. And of course, he's very prescient on that point, isn't he? That is what has happened. Jefferson had also thought that a Bill of Rights would be educational, showing people what we believed and what we stood for. And of course, he's absolutely prophetic on both those points. It is the Bill of Rights that the Supreme Court often turns to, and even the lower courts turn to say, no, they've made it clear this is a right. You can't violate this. So early adopters like Pennsylvania, push the Constitution through, but it starts to get tight. But after Jefferson's letters to Madison, and Madison finally agreeing that he will create a list of amendments and bring them to the floor in the first session of the House, in doing so, the states have the choice to decide to agree on provisional approval, and they do so. Here's the thing to remember. All those debates did not change the Constitution, not one word in them. It did change the national conversation. And that conversation led to the requirement to have a Bill of Rights attached. And thus, with the 9 states, and the idea that they will be there, we have a Bill of Rights will become one of those first priorities. So let's look at what that means. We've already said the Constitution is very specific on the powers of the House and the Senate. Both are very detailed, and that the House has vital powers to give to the people. The Constitution is nearly silent on the executive, and on the judiciary, it's only there in name. But the Senate and the House are both detailed, and the House, is where these bills are going to originate. So we see the creation of the Bill of Rights. Now, recall as well, it didn't, at this time, this is what applies to the Constitution, meaning it applies to the feds, not to the states. Each of the states had their own Bill of Rights. And in fact, it's those states that Madison would go to examine all of the bills of rights that are placed in those states. And, you know, as he could see, Southern states' refusal to recognize blacks or Native Americans as people, things like that. All of these are things he has to try and put together. But remember, there's a reason why all of these people were in favor of a Bill of Rights. The colonies were founded by people who had experienced religious opposition or religious oppression by their governments. And, we often get that wrong. We often think that they came here to get away from, religious oppression. What part of the problem with the Pilgrims, and the reason they were called Puritans, is because they wanted to be more strict than what their government called for. Of course, what they were really saying, they'd been very upset by the fact that, the church had broken with the Catholic Church and then established its own in England. But that's true from many, many different countries. These folks got away because their government was telling them the religion that they had to be part of, and they wanted nothing to do with that. Franklin also personally saw the need for the freedom of press when his brother made fun of Cotton Mather, and his brother did so in the newspaper they owned, and he would end up being imprisoned for that. And of course, colonists died at the Battle of Lexington, which was really the British edict against having armed militia units. Every one of those is reflected in those initial Bill of Rights. So, as I said, who does it apply to? Only the federal government. But the bottom line is we need to remember this Bill of Rights was not ordained. It's a hard fought issue and it required compromise. And it set the original patriots like Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, George Mason against these new men that had come of age in the Revolution. And, with all of that, it had to happen and it had to be approved by first the Congress. And remember, that means 2/3 and then 3/4. We had to make this go. And what Madison did was he went through all of these states, 9 states, with different states having different bills of rights, and tried to boil them down. Basically got down to about 17. And in the committee, they basically got it down to about 12. 9 states would ratify 10 of them in the first 6 months by killing the first 2. Thus, what we think of the First Amendment is actually the third. But with that, they killed that initial 2. And, Virginia, Massachusetts, Georgia, Connecticut, they're the holdouts. And when you add Vermont, they needed 11. Massachusetts approved 8 of them, never got around to getting the whole bill together. In the end, it came down, ironically, to Virginia, to Madison's home state. And the political negotiations would begin. And it'd be 1791 before the combined power of George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, before they could overcome Patrick Henry and all of the other anti-federalists, because those anti-federalists suddenly realized with that concept of a provisional or a conditional approval based on whether or not they got the Bill of Rights, this became their chance to, their last chance to block the Constitution from going into actual use. So part of the problem, of course, was the separation of church and state. But, Madison, Jefferson felt strongly enough on that and got the people behind them. So in the end, Madison, who had not wanted a Bill of Rights, was the one who worked hardest for its approval. And as I said, the House had passed 17 amendments, the Senate passed 12. Then They went through and stripped out some of them, and the others put the stuff back. It became quite a process, but we ended up with 10. And here's the difference. Here was the thing that really is a piece of brilliance on the part of Madison. As we said, the Constitution is telling us all the things you can do. That Bill of Rights, what makes it different in those initial earliest ones, it's the explicit instructions. Congress shall make no law, and then goes on to say whatever, you know, and that's the spirit of the first 8 amendments to the Constitution out of those 10. Constitution with new office of executive power, is very foreign and distasteful to Americans. And the only reason this passed in the end, forget about the Bill of Rights, is the fact that everybody knew that George Washington was going to be that first executive. Thus, they were able to get the approval to put this Constitution in place. And with that first year, we get the important amendments. First Amendment guarantees the right to freedom of speech, of press, and religion, all of which, to be blunt, we have seen just in the last few months be under severe attack in America today. And if we did not have that amendment standing there, who knows what it would be like. It also protects the right to petition the government, to right wrongs. And all of these were things that they'd saw revoked under the British rule. Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, because, of course, back then you brought your own gun to the militia, to what is the equivalent of our National Guard. And as I said, we see, I've mentioned it over and over, it's a disagreement on this point between local and the British that led to the deaths at Lexington and Concord. Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war, but in a manner to which be prescribed by law. In other words, you can't take our house and put people in it against our will. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their houses, their persons, their papers, their effects, against unreasonable searches and seizure, and that shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation. In other words, somebody who says, I saw it, and particularly describing the exact place to be searched and the person or things that are to be seized. Again, violated repeatedly under the British. And this goes back to the old, non-written rules of the Magna Carta, that a man's home is his castle, that you can't just come in. Now, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, they're a little different. They are protections in the trial process. Why? Because the Articles in the States often put in place popular judges, ones that went, that were crowd pleasers. In other words, they didn't follow the laws, they followed what was popular. And there's a very big fear that means judges can be cowed by mobs and do what the mob wishes them to do. And of course, the mob pays no attention to laws or rules. And mobs, of course, were a very real thing back then. 9, 10, and 11, and 12, they define the relationship of rights and of states and the federal government. And 12 is that first fix, the election of the president and vice president, fixing how that electoral college should work. 13, 14, and 15. So those were all the early ones. As I said, around 1791, it will now be decades before we get to the 13, 14, and 15. Those are all the Civil War amendments. Those are all the things to get rid of slavery. And notice it takes multiple tries. We abolish slavery. Then we decide how we're going to make these people citizens with the idea that citizens would get them everything they need, and equal protection, etc. And of course, we find out it doesn't. Women are citizens, but they can't vote. So then we get the 15th Amendment, which says you cannot deny voting based on race. And there we go. And that's where it sits. Of course, we will end up having the Supreme Court decide that some of these things don't apply to ex slaves, exactly the people they were written for, but that's another story. So then we will go into the first 20 years of the 20th century. So another almost 50 years before we get any more, and we get the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment income tax. Rises for the first time. Why? Because we'd been relying upon what? Tariffs? Yes. And as we now wish to sell all of our goods all around the world, because we already are, we want to see other tariffs come down. So we embrace the idea, because we know as we put tariffs on, they raise tariffs, and we saw disaster arise out of that in the 1880s and 90s. Thus, we get the 16th Amendment in the early 20th century, saying, let's move over to get our money from income tax, right? And remember, it follows the laws as to how they can get that income tax. 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators instead of having them appointed, because all of these amendments that you see right here, all coming together, are outgrowths of the progressive agenda that had all started back in the Plains states back in the late 1880s, 1890s. And those were all about, taxation, about popular election of senators rather than appointments, getting rid of the backroom deals was what that concept was. The idea of the prohibition on liquor and women's rights. So those two were very much entwined. And we finally see those happen in the first 20 years of the 20th century. We then have another wait. We now get to the 1930s. And these are, of course, the items that come out of, the Great Depression. Presidential term and secession. That really is saying when, who we'd had a situation where we did not have a vice president. He had died in office, and we'd had that happen a couple of times. What we're going to do about that comes up with this. Much more important, though, was the fact that they move it from later in the year, because remember when this Constitution was created, we wanted to wait until the roads got good. So we wanted to wait until spring, to swear in all these new people. So now we have the presidential term starting in January. And a lot of that was in response. People weren't absolutely positive that the country would still be here by the time FDR was going to take office. And they weren't far wrong. All the bank failures and the bank holiday all happened with that. Of course, we have the repeal of prohibition and the two-term limit on the presidency. Now, that 22nd, of course, happens later. It's not in 1930s, but it's because of the 1930s. It's to prevent another person like FDR from having terms for the rest of his life. And now we're limited to two terms. And then, of course, we jump ahead again into the 1960s, which is really just fine tuning. Presidential vote for DC, abolition of poll taxes, and that's out of that voting rights things that come out of the LBJ era. And, presidential disability and secession. This is really a response to the fact that during during Ike's heart attack, there'd been an informal agreement made that power would be temporarily turned over to the vice president while Ike was out. Because, of course, we believed and, had the sirens running every day. We believed we were going to be attacked by those godless Russians at any moment. So, and they would take advantage of the fact that Ike was out of touch. So we have the presidential disability. Now, those all happened in the 60s. And the 26th happened, I think, in 71, the right to vote at age 18. So, that one, we didn't have to have an amendment to say who could vote, but to change the age was written in there. We changed it to the age of 18. And why? Because men were being drafted and dying in Vietnam. And it was said, if you can be drafted and put your life on the line for your country, you should be able to vote. And then, of course, the throwback 27th Amendment, congressional compensation. It really shouldn't have absolutely had to be there. This was one of the ones that got chopped off in the initial proposals for the Bill of Rights. It was proposed in 1789. It would finally pass in 1991. And really, the major portion of this is just saying you can't vote yourself a pay raise. There has to be an election in between when that vote was held and when the pay raise happens. So that's all the changes, right? Since those are all the amendments, those are the only changes that happen. I don't think so, really. And why? Well, when I say I don't think so, somebody else might say I dissent. The Supreme Court has changed many things, or at least our understanding of the meanings of them. More importantly, the Supreme Court finally, early on, about 20 years into it, decided they actually are the ones who can declare that a law is unconstitutional. You can have a law change things if it's something they're allowed to change. And of course, all of this got sprung on everybody when, Marshall, who really did not get along with Thomas Jefferson, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as Jefferson came in. There was an argument as to whether or not papers had been signed and delivered properly to install people in place. And Jefferson was trying to say no, and he'd put his best man on it, some guy named James Madison, and Madison took it to court. And in doing so, John Marshall threaded the needle. He basically, agreed with Adams that these things had happened, and thus that Jefferson could not undo them. But on the other hand, said, but it waited too long and it did not happen in a timely fashion, ergo, Jefferson wins. So both men won. And what it really did, thus, neither side objected to it. They might grumble, but they didn't object. But what he really did was he isolated into this statement: essential to all written constitutions, that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void, and that courts, as well as other departments, are bound by that instrument. And thus, in Marbury versus Madison, 1802, we suddenly have the concept of judicial review coming under the heading of the Supreme Court. So, one of the things we see today is the fact that we spend a lot of time now suddenly talking about original intent. But I would just propose to you that, funny, Madison had never thought that that's what the Supreme Court was going to do. Neither did anybody else who had been part of it. And when we talk about original intent, I've got more to say about that, but I do want to show you one of the first surprises. It's 1790. The first Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant man with incredible insights, sees the issues, understands the dynamics, grasps the reality of the debt, and notes these have not been paid since the Revolutionary War and the deadline is upon us. He has an answer. He presents to Congress a sweeping act that would give the Treasury the power to create and collect taxes, but more broadly to use tariffs to raise the money to pay all the back notes at full value. All fine and well. But he then outlines the creation of a national bank to hold this money to fund and facilitate government spending. Wait, the government is going to create a national bank? And the first person who jumps up to ask about that, you know, is the man whose house the bill will have to pass through. And Madison steps up and says, where in the Constitution do you find the power to create and run a national bank given to the federal government? And Alexander Hamilton would answer, the Implied Powers Act gives Congress the ability to do what is needed to succeed in their actions to do the jobs required by the enumerated powers. So, in other words, we have all these powers that are lined out and we're told what they can do. There is one little line that says, well, and it's implied that you have the power to do what you have to do to make these enumerated powers happen. And this was certainly news to Madison, who had all but written the Constitution. So when we come to original intent, I say that that really is a bogus argument. Even if you're saying that the original intent is how it was understood by people of the time, equally bogus, I'm sorry. You know, and I would point out to you that both Jefferson and Madison would bend the Constitution to their needs despite original intent. And in fact, it's Jefferson, who was Secretary of State at the time, who will put together the meeting between Hamilton and Madison, and they will horse trade to make a new national government closer to the South. They will call it Washington or the District of Columbia, and they will do so by, the agreement is they will give Hamilton that right. They will not stop the bill from going through, nor will they complain that it's unconstitutional. That will fall to a later president named Jackson. But both Jefferson and Madison, as I said, would bend the Constitution to their needs no matter what the original intent was. They would attempt to start the Nullification Act, the idea that states could decide a law that was unconstitutional because it was unconstitutional in their world, which of course would go nowhere. That's not in the Constitution. But with all that, my take, my personal opinion, original intent, the true original intent was compromise. That's a dirty word today, and possibly with a reason. For a lot of years, the South, was able to keep things, to keep rights away from the former slaves by playing off against the two major parties, and throwing their weight behind whichever side would agree not to have those rules apply to the South. But compromise is necessary, and it's the only way things are going to work. The only other option is extremism, and that's what we're living with today. Somewhere around 1990, a great number of senators, most based in the Great Plains area, all retired because suddenly it all became about party. It all became, you can't make deals across the aisle. The party will decide what you can and can't do. And most of those Great Plains state senators had always worked together to take care of farmers, to take care of agriculture, and thus were the swing votes for all of that. And all of that went away by the 1990s. 1995, it was clearly gone. And thus we have been on this treadmill, this track to where we are today. So I now go back to what I originally asked you. Maybe. Why do we have a government? I said governments provide a platform for protection from unwanted aggression or violence, both internal and external. Absolutely vital, right? But they also provide all the basic services that are needed by a community: fire and police services. We call it public safety, waste management, groundwater protection, streets and sidewalks maintenance, safety, and snow removal. I find those kind of important. It's vital for me to get to work if I'm going to get paid. And it's awfully nice to go out on those snowy mornings and find my streets already plowed, right? And that I don't have to be the one to do it. There's also the issues of parks and all related services, even cemeteries. But we have schools and libraries, which are vitally important, aren't they? That should be really up there at the top of that list, right up there with public safety. And of course, what we've seen in talking about all this, courts are absolutely vital to seeing rights to be upheld. But there's other things, aren't there? Senior citizen programs, building and regulation, housing, planning and zoning, community development, environmental protection. You know, what about leadership services for councils and things like that? All of these are things that are important. All of these are things that we have seen, even those native uh, groups that we looked at, we saw that some aspects of their internal government was social, and that's what some of these are too, aren't they? So, before we wrap this up, I just have one of those, another poll for you. True or false? Our dislike of government is that they do too much. They have too many rules, too many laws, too many thou shalt nots. Is that true? Well, I'd ask you, why do we have a government at all? We've found out that we have to, or we tear each other apart, don't we? Why did we discard the Articles of Confederation? Because they could not and would not ever work. They were not about governing, they were about just working together on one item. That one item, the fight with the British, was gone. What's new about the US Constitution? I said that a lot of it was the idea that had been written down. But of course, the biggest part of it was to boldly state that it is the right of people to have, that all rights flowing to a government come from the people, and to then put in a structure and a framework to carry that out so that those rights of those people could be protected. And we saw how they were doing that, but we also saw that that also requires a court system, doesn't it? And what did I say limited the designers when they were creating the Constitution? They were limited by the fact that they had to be true to what people thought they were aiming toward, what they were going to achieve by having that revolution, by breaking away from what at that time was one of the greatest empires in the world, and certainly one of the strongest. So, with all that, what we really said, and as I said, we needed a government to allow business to flourish. And without business, you did not have jobs. And without jobs, you don't have really any hope of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, do you? It's overlooked right now, but I would like to mention this. James Madison, the man who really looked deeply into the issues and who saw that the only way we were going to do this was to create a central government. Thus, their real goal was decreasing the powers of the individual states over that central government. So I ask you, why in the last 10 to 20 to 30 years have we been working so hard to reverse course on that? What makes us think it would be better, not worse? Those are the things I want you to ponder. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here. I also want to remind you all, we're only here for a limited time. Tell those that you love them. Give them a hug. Think about them, think about their needs. Make sure that every day you know that they know that you love them. It's vital. With that, I wish you all a good night. I hope you enjoyed the program. And I guess I would just say to you, by the way, we are going to get together on December 4th, and we're going to hold the look back at all the great music that happened between 1960, 61, 62, 63. It's a night on the radio on a New Year's Eve where we look back at the 5 years that had happened after that first run of rock and roll. So, with that, I hope you have a great night, and I hope to see you all soon. And if you have any questions, I'm right here. So, thank you very much. And it's really been a pleasure working with all of you.
Thank you, Russ.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
And Russ, there's some comments in the chat. Thank you. Very interesting talk from Pat. Mary says, thanks so much. Great program. Marilyn says, thank you, Russ. And then there were some responses to the different questions you had.
Excellent.
If you have time to.
Yep, I saw those earlier, so that's good. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your feedback too. So you all have a great night, okay?
Thank you, Russ.
Bye-bye.
Russ.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Thanks for being here, everybody.